The reason why some of these investigations are not stellar is because the poor person who's doing it has a million other things that are their core job responsibilities. And this is something that's just been tacked on. It's important that organizations make the space. If you're going to do it internally, give the person the time and the resources to be able to do it properly.
Workplace law is complex and constantly changing. It can be hard to keep up, and the risk of getting it wrong can be costly for businesses. The Coffee and Law podcast is here to help HR professionals and employers stay informed. We'll cover what's changing and how to navigate real workplace situations and everyday people decisions. So grab your favorite warm drink and join us for engaging, practical, and educational conversations with top experts in workplace and employment law.
This podcast provides high-level general information. The perspectives shared by our guests are for educational purposes and do not constitute legal advice. If you have a specific question or concern, please consult a qualified lawyer.
Hi, it's your host, Amy Davies of First 30, jumping in here to share some exciting news. First 30's Onboarding Buddy platform has officially launched. Onboarding Buddy is an intelligent, AI-powered knowledge assistant that gives new hires instant answers using your company's own information. It's secure, Microsoft-backed, and simple to launch. No IT lift or setup fees, and it integrates seamlessly with your HRIS. So if you want a quick, easy, and effective way to improve your organization's new hire experience, I think this might be it. You can reach out to me anytime at amy@first30ready.com. That's amy@first30ready.com. And I'm happy to answer any questions you might have and share a demo. Now, enjoy the show. Welcome back, everyone, to Coffee and Law. We're covering a topic that it's kind of one of those topics you shouldn't love, but I do love talking about it, especially with my friend Dean Benard of Benard and Associates, who I'm very happy was able to join me today. Dean, I know you have like the craziest, most hectic schedule, jumping out when your clients need you at a moment's notice. So we had to reschedule this one today, but that really does, Dean, speak to how in demand you and your organization are. So I thought we would start. We're going to be talking today about workplace investigations. We're going to be talking about when do we need to investigate, and then we're going to talk a little bit about how to investigate. And I know, Dean, we only have 30 minutes or so today, so we're not going to be able to cover nearly everything we need to cover, but hopefully we can scratch the surface. And I know you have an amazing course that our audience can look for as well. So I'm going to make sure that is linked to the show notes. But I would love to hear a little bit from you. Just let everyone know who you are, what you do, and don't worry about telling them where to find you, because we're going to make sure they know how to do that in the show notes.
Okay, well, no problem at all. Thanks, Amy. I'm really happy to be here, and I will always make time for something like this. Anybody who knows me knows that I love to share information, and I love this kind of thing. Some people would say I've never seen a microphone I didn't love. So I'm definitely.
Hey, no, microphones love you too, Dean. So don't worry.
Okay. But a little background. So Benard and Associates is primarily an investigation firm. We also do mediation work, and we've been doing workplace investigations since 2004. My background personally is a bit eclectic. I have some people say a bit of an odd background. My first career was nursing. I was a critical care nurse. Then I moved from that to policing. I moved from that to regulatory investigations. And then eventually in 2004, started my business. So I don't look it, but I'm about 100 years old with all of that background. We do a lot of work with organizations to help them guide them through the investigation process, because it's daunting for many organizations. They want to make sure they get things right. They want to make sure that they're doing everything that is expected of them. And that's what we're there to do.
And there's just so much more risk now, right? Because everybody's carrying a camera on them at all times as well. I'm sure you bump into this a lot. And so it's always been important for organizations to have integrity, do the right thing, investigate when investigations need to happen. But now there's even more pressure because you don't know what kind of evidence is already out there and exists. But I might get us down a little rabbit hole with that.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And it's interesting because I feel like I mean, investigations is a growing area in the workplace. And a lot of that is obviously stimulated by the fact that there's legislative responsibilities to investigate when certain allegations are made. So, that alone has got organizations concerned that they are compliant, that they aren't going to have, for example, in Ontario, the Ministry of Labor knocking on the door saying, you didn't investigate. Everybody wants to be in compliant. Sadly, some organizations, particularly smaller ones, they don't even understand or know that they need to be compliant with these things. They don't know anything about it. So it's an area, I would argue, probably of highest risk in an organization. First, you don't want unpleasant, un bad things happening within your organization. Every employer has a duty to provide a safe, harassment-free workplace, and so no employer should want that happening in their workplace. So for something like that to slip by and not be dealt with can create even bigger problems than the challenge of doing an actual investigation.
Yes, and the cost of doing an investigation, right? So let's talk about the big topic of how does an organization, something happens, how does an organization say to themselves, okay, we do need to investigate this?
That's a great question because I think a lot of organizations struggle with that. We have lots of fancy terms we use when people bring forward a concern. So when you think about it, within an organization, investigation can happen a number of different ways. One can be someone comes forward, files a complaint under the policy that exists, whatever name you give it. They make, respectful workplace, harassment-free workplace, whatever. Someone makes a complaint, and then the question is, well, do we need to investigate this? So, the key is to have a good policy that helps outline exactly what steps should be taken. But when it comes to investigation, it's about doing a threshold analysis to understand, well, what exactly is being complained about. And one of the questions I always say to people is, ask yourself the question, if this is true, we'll figure out if it's true later, but if this is true, would this be harassment? Would this be bullying? Would this be discrimination? And if the answer to that question is yes, then an investigation is an absolute must. And that will make you compliant with the legislation, which demands that these investigations happen. So I think that's a lot of the ways in which an investigation will start. But the other way is when management or human resources discovers concerns that exist, but nobody's coming forward with a complaint. And so you're aware that there could be harassment or bullying going on within the organization, or sexual harassment or discrimination. You've got, I would argue, a legal and moral obligation to deal with that problem and to investigate it. So that would be what we would refer to as the management initiated investigation. Just because someone, you'll have people that will make the mistake of saying, well, nobody complained, so we don't have to investigate. But the reality is that once you become aware, it's a bell you can't unring. So you do need to investigate and that would be that, as I say, that management initiated investigation.
So willful blindness will not make the problem go away, is what you're saying, right?
No, it definitely will not.
Yes. Okay, so something happens. The right people are aware that something is happening. There's multiple ways that they can be made aware that something has happened. So now, what do they do next? How do they get that investigation started?
Well, again, they should have a policy that helps to outline what that looks like. And that's one of the things I say to a lot of organizations, a lot of our clients, to say, let's take a look at your policy, because, some of them have some unrealistic expectations, like an investigation will be completed within 2 weeks, which isn't very realistic. So,
Right.
that's a bit of an aside, but my point is, first, let's look at the policy. Let's see what the policy dictates. We know that we're going to have to do an investigation. We've assessed it. We've determined that there is a threshold that's been met. So then it's figuring out who's going to do the investigation. Is it do we have the in-house capability to do it? Somebody that from HR or someone within the organization that can, fairness being the key point, and neutrally do an investigation? If we don't, do we need to look outside and find somebody that we can bring in to do the investigation? That's the first step. Who's going to do it? And then the next step is, to actually engage in putting together an investigation plan. What do we, I always say these investigations are not rocket science. The first step is we have to figure out what happened. So what questions do we need to ask, and what questions do we need answered in order to understand what happened? And then once we understand what's taken place, the next step is, does what happened, is that a contravention of a policy, right? It's
Mhm.
so 2 steps.
I have a question for you. So I used to work, and people don't know me as this, but like you, I've had a long history before I arrived here at this microphone. And I used to run research, both market research and employee research. And what I found was everyone thinks they know how to ask a question. Right. And I get why it looks so simple on the surface, but I can tell you even the most simple of employee pulse surveys are far more complex, and way more thought goes into how the questions are asked, when they're asked, et cetera, et cetera. So I bring that up because I'm wondering if your experience, as much as I'm sure you've worked with amazing people, right? But people are not doing workplace investigations every day. So is your experience when you step into an organization who's already started an investigation like, ooh, I think, if we were to start this again, we might ask the questions differently. And I guess the question is, what is the quality of the questions you're seeing asked, or the process that you've seen once you get there and you're sort of getting into it?
I guess the best way to answer that question is, I say I've seen the full spectrum. I've stepped into
Sure.
organizations that have done a workplace investigation, and it's been stellar. It's been, whoever did it did a fabulous job. They understood, exactly what questions to ask, how to gather the information, what it means. But then I've seen the other side of it more often, sadly, than the stellar side, where there's huge holes in the investigation. And in fact, one of the services we've started offering to people is, if you don't want to spend all the money to hire us to do the investigation, maybe you should have us coach you through the investigation. So we'll help you make sure you don't make those missteps, like failing to gather information from certain sources. I've even been retained as an expert to provide an expert for court on whether or not an investigation met, a standard, an acceptable standard for an investigation that ensures fairness. And that's a lot of it. A lot of it too is the issue of fairness. If you ask questions the wrong way, if you make assumptions, you're really starting to create, at the very least, an appearance of an unfair process, and potentially, without even realizing it, an actual unfair process. So we see this a lot in organizations, and I don't believe that it's very rarely intentional. I can't honestly say I've seen a situation where I'd say it was purposeful, but it definitely happens, and it happens because good investigators take courses and learn how to do it, but then there's years of experience that go with it. And without the experience and without the frequency of doing investigations, it's very easy to get it wrong.
And you know what to anticipate. Every situation is different, but you've kind of been there, done that. You've seen a lot. So you know how to set up a system that's going to protect everyone, protect the complainant if there is one, protect the organization, and document everything. I bet that is a big issue, as well as the documentation. Can you tell us a little bit about how HR leaders and employers should seek to document everything, all the discussions they're having?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because what I typically see, or what I often see, I should say, is where an investigator will have this sort of little table they've created in a document with a question and a space to answer it, and they've got their 20 questions, and they're going to ask their 20 questions, and whereas a real seasoned investigator isn't going to follow a script or list of questions. They're going to talk to the person and say, talk to me about what happened. They're going to ask big open-ended questions. I think of it as it's a funnel. You start with big open-ended questions, and eventually you narrow your way down to the very specific ones. Documenting all of that within the interview very important. Where I see the misstep is the failing to document all of the stuff in between. How many times did I try to set up this interview? What was the nature of my discussion with the union representative before this interview took place? Because I'm always thinking several steps down the road. I might be in an arbitration, or I might be in court, where I'm going to be asked questions not only about what's within that investigation report, but I'm going to be asked questions about how that report came to exist and what were all the steps and things involved in creating that report. And so, all of this stuff needs to be documented. All the email communications should be saved, everything. Again, it's not overly difficult to do, but it's critically important that it be done. And, organizations have to decide if they're going to do these things in-house, where is that information going to be stored? Because we have to also be thinking about confidentiality. Not everybody in the organization should have access, or even everybody in HR should have access to this information. So these are all things that organizations need to be thinking about when they're conducting these things in-house.
Outplacement and career transition support make a real difference for employees experiencing terminations or layoffs. Offering these services also reduces legal and reputational risk for employers. All of First 30's outplacement programs include access to a live coach, along with 1 year of access to our career transition portal, job search resources, and much more. Programs start at $985 per participant. You can find information about our programs and pricing at first30ready.com/outplacement, or reach out to us anytime at info@first30ready.com. Okay, now I have a question about, we were just talking about carrying around a camera. We're all carrying around cameras all the time. We're also all carrying around recording devices. So my question is this, is there any guidelines around recording these interviews? And I ask that not only from the investigator, and that could be HR, maybe it's you would know, so no one have to worry if you're there. But if I'm an HR leader who's running an investigation, can I record the conversation? Or as an employee, can I record the conversation? And what do I have to disclose that I'm recording it? Many, many questions, Dean. I think you'll know where I'm going with all of this.
There's a few layers to that. So, you will hear people say that, well, it's not illegal. It's not a criminal offense for me to record somebody who I'm engaged in a conversation with. As long as I'm a party to the conversation, I can record it. But when you're taking on the role of an investigator, I believe you have a higher burden, a higher standard that you must operate from. So no investigator should ever be recording any interview or any conversation without the express consent of the individual they're interviewing. We do record all of our interviews, but well, I shouldn't say that. We record about 98% of them, because 2% of people will refuse, because we do always get consent from them. And so that's just critical. As far as employees, this will sometimes happen. I've gone into an interview, especially back in the days when we were face to face. I've gone back into an interview where somebody puts their own recording device on tables and turns it on. And, I, as the investigator, will say, I'm sorry, but I don't consent to being recorded. And I make it a point in every interview I do to say, I'm going to record it, but you can't. And of course, people will immediately get their back up, but I can explain why. And the reason is that we have to be always thinking about the integrity of the investigation. The reason why I'm interviewing somebody one-on-one is because I don't want all the information they share with me to be given to the 5 other people that I'm going to interview as witnesses for that case. If there's a recording out there, I no longer have control over that information being shared. Now, is it being shared anyway? We certainly make it clear to people that we're interviewing, this is a confidential process. Nothing we discuss in here should be repeated or shared with anyone else. Do you agree to that? We get them to agree to that. What they do outside of that consent or outside of that agreement is up to them. We can't really control it, but we have to at least do the best we can to maintain the integrity of the investigation, so we don't consent to union representatives or employees recording the interviews. What we will do is say, when everything is over, when the whole matter is completed, if you want to have your recording of this interview, you can have it then. When everything is that
Okay.
would be like post arbitration, post everything. we will do that, but we do feel like we have to maintain some level of control over the information that's being gathered.
Now, that brings a question that I have, and I'm sure that our audience would have, is I have collected all of this information. I'm doing all of these interviews. And now, who am I obligated to share this file with? Maybe before the case is closed and then after the case is closed. Because if I'm maybe the complainant comes to me and says, oh, I want a copy of all of the evidence that's been collected or the file that you're working on to investigate this case. So, can you give us a little bit more information around what we can share, when we can share it, and what we're obligated to share?
Sure, sure. So again, depending on your jurisdiction, there will be certain requirements. So I'll speak to Ontario since that's where most of our work is done. And what I can say about that is that under the legislation, you are required to share the outcome, to share the findings of an investigation. And you're required also to this would go beyond the investigation, but you're also required to share not necessarily specific information, but you're required to share that steps were taken to rectify the situation. So if there was a case where behavior was substantiated, then you also have to share the fact that something was done about that. But nobody is entitled to receive the actual report. There were, and I recommend to clients that the reports stay in as narrow a circle as possible. Now, that will change if a case goes to arbitration, for example. So pre-arbitration or pre-court, right? Then that report should stay really in the hands of the investigator and the parties responsible for evaluating that report and making decisions connected to it. And that is it. Nobody else should get that report. And the reason I emphasize that is because once that report is out there, it's out there. And a lot of times in an investigation, people will share information, sometimes sensitive information. And I think we owe a duty to everybody involved that there not be some document in the hands of someone that we can't control. How do we know that 3 years down the road, I can tell you a story about a client who actually had an investigation done. I did the investigation. I provided, and they had a policy that the report would go to both parties. And sure enough, that report ended up being copied and ended up in the mailboxes of every other employee in the organization. And,
Wow.
again, a whole other issue to deal with, but I think that we owe it to have some control around that. So that information should be kept very, very in a very narrow field of people.
If it does go to court, there would be probably an obligation to
Yeah.
disclose it to the complainant's legal counsel, correct?
That's right. That's where everything changes.
Okay.
Once we go to
Sure.
arbitration,
Okay.
then we have the rules of disclosure that apply where, yes, we would have to, they would request not only the report, but they would request all the interview notes or interview recordings and all of that information. That's why it's so important to keep close track of all this stuff and keep it well documented, because when it gets to that point, you're going to have to give it all over as disclosure.
Listen, that is where your clients are breathing a sigh of relief that they engage Benard and Associates, because they know that everything is going to be so tidy and perfect, and delivered exactly as the court expects, correct?
We try our best. That's
Yeah,
for sure.
yeah. I've heard good things. Okay, so I always am curious about when a complainant comes forward, or there's an issue and involves a senior leader in the organization. And this would be someone who, as you've kind of hinted at, has access to everything. Like, what is an HR professional meant to do in that situation?
That's another great question. It's important, I think, that to recognize that, first off, nobody in the organization should be above being investigated if their behavior or how they conduct themselves is called into question. I think it's a bit unfair to ask somebody who's, for example, maybe an HR business partner or even an HR generalist or somebody, and even the HR manager or director, to investigate their CEO, for example. And I think that that's when it becomes, I think, far more appropriate to outsource that investigation, so because, if you outsource that to me, I don't owe that CEO anything. I'm not I don't have skin in the game in that respect. So my job is to get to the truth, and I'm going to get to the truth. So it's going to give everybody involved in that investigation much more confidence that there's an independent investigation happening and there's not some bias, whether it be, purposeful or not. It's a difficult position to put somebody junior in the organization compared to the CEO or a vice president, in that position. So I think that's where we often get a lot of investigations that are outsourced to us, even within organizations that have a dedicated investigator in house. When it gets to that level, it goes out, and that's important.
Well, I'm kind of cringing inside because I'm imagining I've worked for small businesses, I've worked for large multinational organizations, and I would just hope that if that landed on my doorstep as an HR professional, that I was in a large multinational organization with several layers and not an organization with 15 people. And then we have to launch an investigation into the owner of the business, right?
Right.
Because that's the Wild West at that point. I mean, it can land in court just like every other case, but at the initiation, it is going to be like the Wild West because they're not going to have the same processes and protocols and layers and resources of a large, complex organization.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a lot of organizations too that, it's not always somebody who's senior in the organization. Sometimes it's somebody who's a real impact player, and there's sometimes a reluctance to pursue an investigation simply because of that. So, it's a very awkward position to be in, and organizations have to think very carefully about who they have handling these matters in those situations.
I really want to know this one as well because I think this is something organizations deal with a lot. And you've talked a little bit about it, but an anonymous complaint comes in.
Yeah,
Now, what do I do?
yeah, I know that's the one um, that really bothers people because, an anonymous complaint could be a malicious complaint. It could be a very legitimate complaint. And I think that the first thing I would do if I was in the shoes of the person in HR who's received this is the first thing I'd be asking myself is, if I'm being very honest with myself based on my experiences with this organization, does anything about this, is there anything about this that where this makes sense? Where I think that this could be legitimate. Regardless, it's something that it still needs to be dealt with. And I think that a lot of organizations struggle because, if someone says, for example, they submit a complaint that said, I want to complain that so and so in shipping and receiving is being bullied by all the other people in shipping and receiving. So what do you do with that? Or it could even be something more vague, like somebody in shipping and receiving is being bullied. So, you have to come up with a plan for how you're going to look into that. I don't think it's appropriate to ignore it. So the next step would be, well, maybe we can, and this is where HR has to be, thoughtful about it, but maybe we make some preliminary inquiries. We don't necessarily launch into a full-blown investigation. We don't even know who we're investigating, but maybe we launch some preliminary inquiries where we just try to make some observations, maybe talk to the manager of that particular department, see if we can find out, what might be happening within that department. And then with every little piece of information, it will inform the next step. We've created a whole separate company to deal with this because organizations really struggle with it. So one of the things
Sure.
we did is we created a company called Confidentel. And what Confidentel is it's an anonymous portal. Now, these portals exist. Typically, they're just a technical solution where, someone can make an anonymous complaint and it lands on someone's desk at the organization. Whereas what we've said is, why don't we create a portal where people can make an anonymous complaint, but it comes to us. And then we
Hmm.
ask that person questions while they maintain their anonymity in a space where they're comfortable because they're not dealing with anyone at the organization. They're dealing with a third party independent.
A third party.
And
Yeah.
then we ask them questions because a lot of times we can discover what we need to do by getting just a few questions answered. But you got to be able to ask the questions. So the portal allows that person to maintain their anonymity and to speak to somebody who's a third party. Then we can put it all together in a package, give it to the organization, to the appropriate person in the organization, because what if the complaint's about the CEO? well, then it probably should be going to the board or going to external legal counsel. So in those cases, we can make sure it gets to the right person, and we can give them some options for how they might wish to, to deal with it moving forward.
And we'll make sure that we link to that resource in the show notes as well, Dean. Now, we're running out of time, but I just want to make sure that there's anything that you're like, oh, I wished Amy had asked me this question, or this is something our audience really needs to know. Is there anything that's kind of burning that I missed that I should have asked?
No, not really. I mean, again, the time we have is pretty hard.
We could talk about this forever.
We could. There's lots of things we could talk about. I think the key thing to think about when it comes to investigations is you've got to make them a priority. This shouldn't be something that someone's doing off the side of their desk when they've got a million other responsibilities. This is one of the big issues that I see, is the reason why some of these investigations are not stellar is because the poor person who's doing it has, a million other things that are their core job responsibilities. And this is something that's just been tacked on. It's important that organizations make the space. If you're going to do it internally, give the person the time and the resources to be able to do it properly.
And always be prepared for when something like this comes up. That's why I love the idea of taking your course. If I was in HR, I certainly would do that, because then you've kind of done the hard work before the difficult situation presents. You're not scrambling trying to take Dean's entire course in a weekend so that on Monday morning you're an expert on investigations. So get ahead of the issues, set people up for success, and make sure that people have all of the information and the expertise they need available to them before something this happens. Okay, so thank you so much, Dean. We have one last little segment, and I'm sure you have, again, a million stories you could tell, but we have our little spill the tea segment. So is there a story that you can share with us, or an experience? It could be funny, it could be serious, whatever you want. But we love to spill a little tea on coffee and law.
It's funny. I knew this question would be coming because I've watched previous episodes, and I thought to myself, I have a million stories I could tell.
I bet.
Gotta be honest with you, I'm terrified to tell a story that might somehow get tied back to the people that were involved. So I'm so concerned about confidentiality. So rather than a story, I'm going to let you in on a secret.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm ready.
Okay. Well, the secret that I want to share with you is that most organizations already know who the problem is before the investigation even starts.
That is so you've got that. I agree with you there.
Yeah. Like, I've seen many investigations unfold, and particularly the dramatic ones. What's shocking isn't usually the behavior. What's shocking is that as the investigation unfolds, people are like, "Oh yeah, no, well, I knew about that." I have this thing about investigations. I always say to people that there's three people involved in a harassment complaint, or three groups of people. Let's say it that way. There's the alleged harasser. There's the person who's making the complaint, or the victim, and there's the watchers. And the watchers are the reason why these things continue to happen. There's always a whisper network happening within organizations, and people know, oh, that's just how that person is. That person's brilliant, but they're difficult. And the problem is that everybody ends up adjusting around the behavior instead of addressing the behavior. And so small things end up exploding. Small things become big things because nobody's dealing with it. So now we end up with this formal complaint that needs to be investigated, possibly Ministry of Labor, lawsuits, grievances, all kinds of things, because really nobody's dealing with it. And so the real tea, if I'm going to continue with that analogy, is that investigations don't typically uncover, villains. They expose tolerated patterns. Sometimes it's things like, I've had cases where somebody who's the top salesperson in the organization, 50% of the work that organization is doing is because of this one person, but they are a serial sexual harasser. And I've literally had cases like this where the organization has resisted investigating for ages. Then suddenly it blows up. We come in and do the investigation. Obviously, and again, everybody gets a fair process. It's not like we're pre-concluding that people are bad and doing these things, But again, this is often what we learn after the fact. We gather all the information. It's a case that's very, very clear that this person's been engaging in this behavior, and the organization still wants, they don't want to get rid of them because they're too valuable to the organization. So, I'm not saying I think most organizations do the right thing, but my concern here is that when we turn a blind eye to behavior because somebody carries a certain value or carries a certain amount of authority, right? Or maybe people are just intimidated and don't want to be involved. When we allow that type of thing to happen, then small things become big things and big things become investigations. And in the end, it costs the organization a lot more money. So, this is to me, this is the real underbelly of this kind of work, that we could be doing so much more on the prevention side. And I think organizations really need to start turning their attention to how do we prevent the harassment complaint, right? And if they do that, yeah, they'll invest some resources to it, but they'll be a lot better off in the long run.
And they're losing other talent as a result of that. But I mean, this can just go on, and it's such an important point that you've brought up now. We could have a whole other episode just on this, and maybe we will one day. I used to often talk about why bullies get, I'm going to call them bullies. I know that there was probably more extreme language we can use around it, but bullies get promoted in organizations, and what are the patterns that get them to where they are, and what are their behaviors that make them look committed versus, and the enablers that make all of this happen. And what a company could do is implement the system you have and then get a lot of complaints through that and start understanding what is they can read the tea leaves.
Yeah,
Let's say
exactly.
it that way. We're spilling the tea. Let's read the tea leaves, everyone, now.
Yeah, exactly. I think that kind of approach is what will allow a company to not only talk about integrity, but to demonstrate integrity.
Well, listen, Dean, you'll have to be a regular, because there's just so much to talk about when it comes to workplace investigations. Even before we recorded this, I had someone request this topic as well. So I want to thank you so much for taking the time that is very precious to you and to your clients to spend a little time with us here at Coffee and Law. And I also want to mention, once again, I have a guest on the show recommended by Nina Gupta. I mean, you were recommended to me many years ago. We've since become friends, and I'm very happy for that. And you're such a great person to have in my network, a great supporter, and a person that I love to advocate for as well, because you do such great work.
I'm blushing with all of that, but
I bet.
no, it's been an absolute pleasure, Amy. It's always, I love having a conversation about these things, especially with good friends, and hopefully people will find some benefit from all of this. So thank you.
I've no doubt they will, and I want to thank you, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. And we will see you at the next Coffee and Law.